Tonight we find ourselves in a quiet reading room in Florence, the kind of place where the loudest sound is the subtle turn of a page and the occasional cough from a visiting scholar who's had too much espresso. You've requested a specific document from the archive, a ledger, they told you, from a vineyard outside the city, dated 1542 through 1581. When the librarian brings it out, you're struck first by the sheer weight of it. The leather binding is cracked and worn, dark brown like dried tobacco, and the pages inside are stiff, yellowed, covered in handwriting so small and precise you almost need a magnifying glass to make out the individual words. You open it carefully, the spine creaking in protest, and you're immediately transported into a world where someone, somewhere, decided that every single thing in their life needed to be written down. The first page hits you with a jolt of intimacy. It's not poetry or philosophy or anything you'd expect from the Renaissance. It's numbers, lists, accounts. January 12, 1542. Bought 3 new pruning hooks, paid 6 soldi. Repaired the handle of the large press, 2 soldi to the carpenter. 1 sack of sulfur for treating the vines, 4 soldi. And it goes on, line after line, year after year, until you realize you're holding 4 decades of someone's life reduced to ink and arithmetic. This is the tax record of a single vineyard, yes, but it's also something far stranger and more human. It's the diary of a man who never meant to keep a diary, who only wanted to keep track of his expenses, and in doing so accidentally left behind a portrait of himself and his world so detailed you could almost step inside it. Now, if you were the owner of this vineyard in the 16th century, you probably wouldn't survive this story, not because anything particularly violent happens, but because the 16th century had a delightful habit of killing people with things we'd now consider minor inconveniences. A bad harvest, a summer fever, a disagreement over water rights that escalated into a knife fight. You name it. The Renaissance could kill you with it. But here, in these pages, the man who owned this land managed to outlast plague, war, and at least 3 separate hailstorms that destroyed his crops. He survived by paying attention, by counting everything, by reducing the chaos of the world to neat columns of debits and credits. And you're about to do the same, at least for the next hour or so. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I know the algorithm likes to pretend that every video is a life or death emergency that demands your immediate interaction. But the truth is, this is a story about a 400-year-old vineyard ledger. It'll be here tomorrow. So subscribe if you want, but only if you mean it. Only if you actually like this sort of slow, quiet digging through the past. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You settle into the chair, the Florentine afternoon light slanting through tall windows and catching the dust motes floating above your head. The ledger lies open on the foam rest they've provided, and you gently turn another page. The handwriting shifts slightly here. Still the same hand, but perhaps written at a different time of day, or with a different quill. You notice the ink has faded from black to a brownish rust on some pages, while others remain crisp and dark. The paper itself varies, too. Some sheets are thick and creamy, others thin enough to see the ghost of writing on the reverse side. This man reused paper when he could. You realize. He was thrifty, careful, the kind of person who saved string and nails and probably had strong opinions about how long a loaf of bread should last. You begin to piece together the basics. The vineyard is called Illinois Poggio, the little hill, and it sits about a day's walk from Florence, up in the rolling country where the air cools faster in the evening and the grapes grow small and sweet. The owner's name appears on an early page, written with a flourish that seems almost out of place among all these numbers. Messer Giovanni Battista Orsini, proprietor. A noble name, but a minor one. The Orsini family produced cardinals and condottieri, but Giovanni Battista was not one of them. He was a second son, perhaps, or a cousin twice removed from the main line. He had this vineyard, a modest house, and apparently nothing else to do but count things. The first entries are from January, as you saw, and they set the tone for everything that follows. Every transaction, no matter how small, finds its way into this book. You see payments to laborers for pruning, for hauling stones, for mending walls. You see purchases of rope, of wine for the workers to drink while they worked, of salt meat to feed them during the long winter days. There's an entry for 1 pair of boots for the boy who chases birds from the grapes. The boy's name isn't given, only his function. He's just the bird boy. And his boots cost 12 soldi, and you wonder if he appreciated them, if they kept his feet dry through the wet spring months. And then, tucked between the accounts for February and March, you find something unexpected. A note, written in the margin, in the same hand but smaller, more cramped. Tonight the wolves came down from the hills, took 2 sheep from the lower pasture. The dogs drove them off, but not before much noise and fear. It's not an expense. It's not a tax record. It's just a man, writing down what happened, because maybe he needed to tell someone and the only listener he had was this book. You stare at that marginal note for a long moment, feeling the strangeness of it. 480 years ago, a man sat by candlelight, dipped his quill in ink, and wrote about wolves. And now you're reading it. That's the magic of archives, the quiet miracle of paper and ink. You're not just looking at numbers. You're listening to a voice. You step out of the archive and into the imagined landscape of Illinois Poggio, because the ledger has already begun to paint it for you in strokes of ink and indirect detail. The property sits on a south-facing slope. You know this because the entries mention which rows of vines ripen first each year, and which sections remain stubbornly green well into September. The soil here is what they call galestro, a crumbly, schistous stuff that reflects heat back up onto the grapes and gives the wine a flinty edge. You can almost feel it under your boots as you walk, the crunch of broken stone and dry earth, the way the hill forces you to lean forward just slightly to keep your balance. The ledger guides you like a map drawn in words rather than lines. There's the olive grove first, a stand of perhaps 50 trees, their trunks gnarled and twisted with age. The records show they were already old when Giovanni Battista began keeping accounts. Pruned the ancient olives, paid 3 laborers for 4 days, 12 soldi each. You wonder what makes an olive tree ancient in the 16th century, and you realize these same trees might still be standing today, somewhere outside Florence, still dropping their fruit onto the same rocky soil. The olives were pressed for oil, most of it consumed right there on the property, but some sold at market in the spring when prices were highest. Giovanni Battista notes the yield each year with almost religious precision. 134 pounds of oil from the press, 12 pounds lost to sediment and leakage. Everything leaks. You learn from this ledger. Wine leaks, oil leaks, money leaks through your fingers no matter how tightly you grip. Below the olive grove, the land opens into the vineyard proper. Rows of Sangiovese and Canaiolo grapes stretch across the hillside, their canes trained low to the ground on simple wooden stakes. The ledger tells you how many stakes were replaced each spring. Cut new chestnut posts from the woodlout, 4 to 7 of them, sharpen the ends with the axe. And how many bundles of willow withes were used to tie the vines to those stakes. You see the workers moving through these rows in your mind, their hands rough and stained, their breath misting in the cool March air. They carry knives and bundles of twine, and they move with the practiced slowness of men who have done this work every spring since they could walk. At the eastern edge of the vineyard, there's a wall. The ledger mentions it repeatedly because it kept falling down. repaired the dry stone wall below the chestnut grove, 10 loads of stone gathered from the lower field, paid 2 men for 6 days. And then, 3 months later, the wall collapsed again after the heavy rains. Lost 3 young vines to the slide. Much cursing. That last bit isn't in the ledger, of course, but you add it yourself because you know it must be true. Anyone who's ever repaired a wall only to watch it fall again knows exactly what Giovanni Battista said when he walked out that morning and saw the stones scattered across his vines. Behind the wall, the land rises again into woodland, chestnut and oak, mostly, with some stands of beech in the cooler hollows. This was the vineyard's other economy, the one that doesn't make it into the romantic paintings of Tuscan hillsides. The ledger records timber sales, charcoal burning, the collection of acorns for the pigs. You see entries for mast feeding, turning the pigs loose in the woods to fatten on fallen acorns, and for chestnut flour, ground at the mill, kept for winter bread. The woods were not just scenery. They were the vineyard's pantry, its lumberyard, its source of heat and light and food when the grapes failed and the wine turned to vinegar. And then there's the house itself. It appears in the ledger mostly through its problems. New thatch for the roof after a storm. Repairs to the oven when the arch cracked. A locksmith called out from Florence because someone stole a ham from the smokehouse and Giovanni Battista wanted better security. You piece together a building of stone and plaster, 2 stories tall, with shuttered windows that faced south to catch the winter sun. There was a kitchen on the ground floor with a massive hearth, a cellar below it where the wine aged in barrels, and upstairs a handful of rooms where the family slept. The workers, you learn, did not sleep in the house. They had their own cottages scattered across the property, small structures of wattle and daub with thatched roofs and earthen floors. The ledger mentions repairs to these cottages too, always grudgingly, always the minimum necessary to keep the workers from leaving. Between the house and the vineyard, there's a courtyard of packed earth where the press sits under a wooden shelter. This is the heart of the operation, the place where grapes became wine and where the ledger's numbers suddenly come alive. You can see the press itself, a massive beam of oak, weighted with stones, that slowly descended onto baskets of grapes and squeezed out the juice. The ledger records its maintenance in loving detail. Greased the screw with pork fat, replaced 2 broken slats in the basket, bought new ropes for the windlass. This machine was the most expensive thing Giovanni Battista owned, and he treated it accordingly. Around the courtyard, the ancillary buildings cluster like chicks around a hen. There's the chicken coop, which you know about because the ledger tracks egg production with the same obsessive care as everything else. Eggs gathered this week, 43. Eaten, 12. Sold at market, 30. Kept for hatching, 1. 1 egg for hatching. 1 egg that might become a chicken that might lay more eggs. Giovanni Battista was not a man who left much to chance. There's the pigsty, empty most of the year while the pigs rooted in the woods, but filled to bursting in the winter when they were brought in for fattening and eventual slaughter. You see the entries for slaughter days. Killed 3 pigs, saved the blood for sausage, salted the hams, gave the offal to the workers as was customary, and you catch a glimpse of the rhythm that governed this place. Nothing wasted. Everything counted. And finally, at the edge of everything, there's the road. A dusty track that wound down the hillside and eventually joined the larger road to Florence. The ledger notes when the road needed grading, when the bridges washed out, when travelers passed through and bought wine or cheese or simply asked for a night's shelter. You see an entry for hospitable expenses, a phrase that makes you smile, detailing the cost of bread and wine given to a group of pilgrims on their way to Rome. Giovanni Battista recorded the charity, but he also recorded the cost. Even kindness had its price, and he was not the kind of man to forget it. You stand at the edge of this imagined property, looking back at the house, the vineyard, the woods, and you realize that every inch of it exists in the ledger. Every stone, every tree, every chicken and pig and worker. Giovanni Battista wrote it all down. And in doing so, he gave you a map not just of his land, but of his mind. A mind that craved order, that believed if you could just count everything and write it down, you could keep the chaos at bay. You know, because you've seen the entries for wolves and collapsed walls and disease vines, that he was wrong. Chaos always finds a way in. But you also know he never stopped trying. And that's its own kind of poetry. You turn back to the ledger's opening pages, searching for the man behind the numbers, and slowly Giovanni Battista Orsini begins to emerge from the columns of figures like a face appearing in a mist. He was not a wealthy man, you quickly realize, despite his noble surname. The vineyard generated enough to live on, but not enough to flourish. Some years he recorded a small surplus, carefully set aside in a locked chest whose key he kept on a string around his neck. Other years he borrowed, and those borrowings appear too, listed with the same precision as everything else. Lent from Antonio the wool merchant, 20 florins, to be repaid at harvest with interest of 1 barrel of new wine. You get the sense of a man perpetually dancing on the edge of solvency, always one bad season away from ruin, and always refusing to acknowledge that ruin might actually come. He was educated. That much is clear from the handwriting itself. It's the script of someone who learned to write in a school, who practiced forming letters according to the rules, who probably owned at least a few books even if the ledger never mentions them. But his education was practical, not scholarly. He writes in Italian, not Latin, and his spelling follows the logic of spoken language rather than classical rules. Vigna becomes vina sometimes. Uva loses its V and becomes UA. He was writing the way he spoke, the way his workers spoke, and you catch yourself sounding out the words under your breath, hearing the accent of 16th century Tuscany in their shapes. His age when he started the ledger. You do the math based on scattered clues. He mentions a son born in 1530, so if he married in his late 20s, he was probably born around 1500. That means he was in his early 40s when he began this obsessive record-keeping, a man already middle-aged by the standards of the time, with a lifetime of experience behind him and perhaps a growing awareness that he needed to hold on to things before they slipped away. The ledger itself becomes a kind of memory, a way of ensuring that nothing he did, nothing he spent, nothing he lost would ever be completely forgotten. You wonder about his family. His wife appears rarely, and always indirectly. Paid the midwife for attending my wife in her confinement, 2 florins. Bought cloth for my wife to make new shirts, 12 braccia of linen. She has no name in these pages, only a function, and you find yourself wishing Giovanni Battista had been just a little less practical, just a little more sentimental. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the ledger was his space, his domain, and his wife had her own record somewhere else, in a different book, tracking the eggs and the cheese and the linen in a way that made sense to her. Historians still argue whether women in Renaissance Italy kept their own accounts, or whether their economic lives were simply subsumed into their husbands' records. You look at the blank spaces in this ledger, the things that aren't counted, and you suspect the truth was more complicated than any single document can tell. The children appear more frequently, because children cost money. There are shoes and shirts and lessons. Paid the priest for teaching my son to read, 4 soldi a month. And eventually marriages and dowries and the slow, expensive process of launching the next generation into the world. You count at least 5 children who survived to adulthood, which was actually quite good for the 16th century. The ledger notes the deaths of 3 others, briefly, almost clinically. Buried my infant daughter, paid the gravedigger and the priest, 3 florins. That's all. No lament, no outpouring of grief. Just the cost of putting a child in the ground. But you notice that the entry is smudged, as if the page got wet somehow. And you tell yourself it was rain through a leaky roof, or spilled wine, or anything except what you know it probably was. Giovanni Battista had neighbors, and he had opinions about them. The ledger is remarkably candid on the subject, though you have to read between the lines. Dispute with Matteo da Panzano over the boundary stone below the wood. He moved it again. I moved it back. He threatens to bring the magistrate. Bought wine from the fattoria across the valley because ours is not ready and the guests expect something to drink. It was thin and sour. They overcharged me. I will remember. Lent my large cart to the widow Bensi because her ox died and she had no way to bring in her hay. She sent cheese later as thanks. The cheese was good. These are the threads of village life, the small dramas and alliances that played out across decades, and Giovanni Battista recorded them all because they cost or saved him money. And money was how he understood the world. His religion appears in the ledger too, though not perhaps in the way you'd expect. There are payments to the church, certainly, tithes and offerings and fees for masses said for his dead parents. But there are also entries that suggest a more personal faith. Gave alms to a poor man at the gate. One soldo. Promised a candle to San Giovanni if the grapes survived the hailstorm. They did. Bought the candle today. Cost 6 soldi. Took it to the church myself. This was a man who bargained with God the way he bargained with Antonio the wool merchant, offering payment for services rendered, keeping track of who owed what. It's not particularly pious by modern standards, but it was probably perfectly normal for his time. Heaven was real, saints had power, and a candle was a reasonable price to pay for their intervention. As the years pass in the ledger, you begin to notice changes in Giovanni Battista. The handwriting grows shakier, though still recognizable. The entries become shorter, more repetitive. He starts forgetting things, then remembering he forgot and adding them later in the margins with little notes of self-reproach. Forgot to record the sale of 3 barrels to the tavern keeper in Settignano. He paid last month. I must be more careful. There's a poignancy in these small lapses, a sense of a mind slowly losing its grip on the details that once defined it. He was getting old, and he knew it, and he fought against it with the only weapon he had, the ledger itself. You wonder what he looked like. The ledger doesn't say, of course, but you imagine him as he appears in so many Renaissance portraits, a man with a high forehead and a long nose, dressed in dark wool, his hands stained with ink at the fingertips. He sits at a table by the window, the ledger open before him, a stack of coins on one side and a loaf of bread on the other because he's counting everything, even his lunch. Outside, the vineyard stretches down the hillside, the workers moving through the rows, the donkeys braying in the stable. And inside, Giovanni Battista writes, and writes, and writes, trying to hold it all together with nothing more than a quill and a pot of ink. You lean closer to the page, because it's time to look not at what the ledger says, but at the hand that said it. The handwriting itself tells a story, and you've learned to read those stories after hours in archives like this one. The ink flows differently across different pages, sometimes thin and scratchy when the quill was dull, sometimes dark and bold when Giovanni Battista had just sharpened his pen. You can tell when he was tired. The letters slant slightly more to the right. The crosses on his T's grow longer and more careless. You can tell when he was angry. The pressure increases, the ink digs into the paper, and once, just once, you find a page where the quill actually punctured through, leaving a small hole surrounded by a blot of ink like a wound. This was a man who wrote every day, or nearly every day, for 40 years. That's more than 14,000 days of putting pen to paper. of recording the price of eggs and the cost of nails and the wages paid to men whose names you're only beginning to learn. The sheer physical labor of it is staggering. Each entry required dipping the quill, touching it to the page, forming the letters, waiting for the ink to dry before closing the ledger. Giovanni Battista spent weeks of his life just dipping and writing, building this monument to his own carefulness one stroke at a time. You start to recognize his habits. He always began a new year with a fresh page, writing the date in a slightly larger hand and sometimes adding a small decorative flourish, a spiral, a cross, once what appears to be a tiny grape cluster. He always left margins, though they grew narrower as the years passed and paper became more expensive. He always recorded purchases before sales, as if buying something was more urgent than selling it, or perhaps just easier to remember. And he always double-checked his figures. You see this in the corrections, the numbers written and then crossed out and rewritten above, the little dots he added to columns to help him add them correctly. He made mistakes, and he caught them, and he fixed them. And in those small corrections you see a mind perpetually at war with its own fallibility. The ink itself changes over the decades. Early entries are in a deep black that has faded to brown, made from gall nuts and iron sulfate according to recipes that housewives and scribes had used for centuries. Later entries shift to a bluer black, perhaps a different recipe, perhaps ink bought from a stationer in Florence rather than mixed at home. The very last pages use an ink that has eaten through the paper in places, leaving the words legible but fragile, the letters floating on islands of decay. Iron gall ink could do that when the formula was too acidic, and you wonder if Giovanni Battista noticed, in his final years, that his words were slowly destroying the very pages they were written on. But the real story is in the man himself, the physical presence you sense behind every mark. Giovanni Battista wrote with his right hand. You can tell from the angle of the downstrokes. He sat at a desk or table, not on his lap, because the writing is too consistent for that. He used a quill cut to a medium width, not too fine and not too broad. The kind of practical tool used by someone who wrote a lot but didn't need to impress anyone with calligraphy. And he wrote quickly, or at least efficiently, because the letters flow into each other in ways that suggest practice and comfort. This was not a man laboring over each word. This was a man writing the way other people breathe. Sometimes another hand appears in the ledger, and when it does, you feel a small shock of intrusion. The first time is in 1563, when a page of accounts is followed by a note in a different script, looser, larger, less disciplined. My father being ill, I write this in his place. The grapes were harvested today, 18 baskets, less than last year. He asks me to record it exactly. This is the son, the one who learned to read from the priest at 4 soldi a month. He writes in his father's book, following his father's rules, trying to be exactly the kind of careful his father always was. And he almost succeeds. But you can see the differences, the way he forms his A's differently, the way he abbreviates soldi in a slightly different way. His imitating, but his not the same. He never could be. The second hand appears again a few months later, then more frequently as the 1560s progress. You watch Giovanni Battista's handwriting grow shakier, and you watch his sons take over more and more of the daily entries. By 1568, the father's hand appears only in the margins, adding comments, correcting figures, making his presence known even when he could no longer hold the pen for a full page. I checked these numbers and they are correct. GB, he writes in one margin, the letters trembling but still recognizable. It's like watching a man fade from existence one entry at a time, leaving behind only these ghostly traces of himself. And then, in 1571, the handwriting changes completely. A new scribe takes over, not the son, but someone else. Someone who writes in a neat, professional hand that feels entirely different from the Orsini family style. The entries become more standardized, less personal. The marginal comments stop. The little flourishes at the beginning of each year disappear. The ledger becomes what it always pretended to be, a dry record of income and expenses, nothing more, nothing less. Giovanni Battista is gone, and the book he kept for 40 years has passed into other hands. You wonder about that first scribe, the man himself. What did he look like when he wrote? Did he sit by candlelight in the winter, his breath misting in the cold air of an unheated room? Did he write outdoors in the summer, finding a patch of shade where he could see the vineyard while he worked? Did he ever pause, dip his pen, and look out at the hillside and think about anything besides the numbers? The ledger doesn't say, but you like to imagine that sometimes, just sometimes, he let himself drift. That he wrote, picked 40 baskets of grapes and then sat for a moment, remembering the weight of them, the smell, the way the juice stained your hands purple and took days to wash off. That he was human, in other words, despite his best efforts to disappear into arithmetic. The physical book itself bears the marks of his use. The corners are rounded from being carried, perhaps in a satchel or under an arm. The spine is cracked in several places where he opened it too roughly or left it in the sun. There are wine stains on some pages, real wine stains, from a glass or cup that sat too close to the ledger while he wrote. You can almost see him there, a cup of his own wine at his elbow, taking a sip now and then as he added up the day's totals. The wine would have been young and rough, the kind you drink because it's there, not because it's good. But it was his wine, from his grapes, and that must have tasted better than anything money could buy. On one page, near the end of his years, you find something that makes you stop. It's a list of expenses from 1569, written in his son's hand, but at the bottom there's an addition in the father's trembling script. Total for the year, 347 florins, 12 soldi. A good year. All things considered. I am tired. That's all. No explanation of what tired meant. Tired from writing, tired from age, tired from the endless work of holding a life together. Just the word, sitting there at the bottom of a column of numbers, saying more than all the other pages combined. The ledger turns to January, and you feel the cold seep through the pages. January in 16th century Tuscany meant short days and long nights, frost on the ground most mornings, and a kind of quiet that settled over the vineyard like a blanket. The workers moved slowly when they moved at all, their breath clouding in the air, their hands tucked into their armpits for warmth between tasks. Giovanni Battista recorded it all with his usual precision, and as you read, you begin to understand the rhythm of the dormant season, the way a vineyard prepares for sleep and for the violent awakening of spring. January 1st, and the first entry of the new year is always the same. Paid the men for their work in December, counted out in the kitchen, each man came and received his wages. You see the list of names, the same names year after year, with the amounts they earned and sometimes a note about deductions for bread or wine advanced during the month. The men lined up at the kitchen door, stamping their feet against the cold, and Giovanni Battista sat at the table with his coin box and his ledger, paying each one in copper and silver while his wife or a servant ladled out hot soup to warm them before the walk home. This was the ritual that began each year, the acknowledgement that the work continued even when the vines stood bare and the ground lay hard as stone. Then the pruning started. You see it in entry after entry. Began pruning the lower vineyard today, for men working, will take perhaps 2 weeks. The men moved through the rows with curved knives, cutting back the canes to the 2 or 3 buds that would bear next year's fruit. It looked violent, this cutting, this hacking away of what the vine had grown the previous summer. But the vine needed it. needed to be cut back hard so it would send out strong new growth when the weather warmed. Giovanni Battista knew this, had known it since he was a boy watching his father's workers do the same thing. He recorded the number of men, the number of days, the number of bundles of prunings that would be saved for firewood or for tying up next year's vegetables in the kitchen garden. You notice something interesting in the pruning accounts. Some years, Giovanni Battista hired extra men for this work. Other years, he did it with his regular crew, the same half-dozen laborers who worked the vineyard year-round. The difference, you realize, was money. In good years, when the previous harvest had sold well and the chest was full, he could afford to bring in help and finish the pruning quickly. In lean years, he stretched it out, letting the regular men work slower, paying them less overall by spreading the same work across more days. It was a kind of economics you don't learn in textbooks, the economics of survival on the edge of subsistence, where every decision balanced speed against cost and both against the simple fact that the vines had to be pruned before spring no matter what. Between the pruning entries, you find the smaller tasks that filled the winter days. Mending tools, for one thing. Took the broken hose to the blacksmith in the village, had them reforged, paid for soldi each. Sharpened all the pruning knives myself, took most of a day. Giovanni Battista was not above doing this work himself. You notice. He didn't sit in the house while his men froze in the vineyard. He was out there with them, or in the shed with a whetstone, keeping the edges keen and the work moving. The ledger doesn't boast about this, doesn't even mention it directly except through these small entries that imply his presence. But you feel it anyway. The sense of a man who led from the front because there was no other way to lead. The sheep came down from the high pastures in January, driven by shepherds who rented the vineyard's fallow fields for winter grazing. You see the negotiations recorded in the margin. Agreed with the shepherd from Mangona to take his flock for the winter, payment of 10 cheeses at Easter and the manure left behind. The manure was the real treasure here. The dark gold that would be spread on the vines in the spring to feed the coming year's growth. Giovanni Battista understood soil the way he understood money, as something that had to be invested if you wanted a return. He recorded the arrival of the sheep, the number of them, the condition of their wool, and always, the promise of those 10 cheeses that would appear in the ledger again come April. January was also the month for taking stock. You find long lists in the early pages of each year, inventories of everything the vineyard contained. Wine in the cellar, 12 barrels of the 1541 vintage, 8 barrels of the 1540, 3 barrels of the 1539 which is turning to vinegar and must be used for cooking or sold cheap. Oil in the jars, 40 pounds, green and peppery, will keep until summer if we are careful. Grain in the barn, 20 sacks of wheat, 6 sacks of barley, 4 sacks of rye for the workers' bread. Salt meat in the smokehouse, 2 hams, 6 shoulders, a tub of salted tripe that the dogs keep trying to reach. These inventories were Giovanni Battista's way of facing reality, of knowing exactly what he had and exactly what he would need before the next harvest came in. If the numbers looked tight, he could adjust, buy less, sell more, tighten belts all around. If they looked comfortable, he could relax, just a little, and maybe buy that new cloak he'd been wanting for 3 winters. The weather appears in January entries too, usually as a complaint. Heavy snow today, could not work in the vineyard, sent the men home with bread and a little wine. Fog so thick you could not see the house from the stable, work impossible until midday. Thaw came suddenly, the paths turned to mud. The men spent half the day pulling the cart out of a ditch. Giovanni Battista recorded these setbacks with the same precision as everything else, not because he enjoyed complaining but because weather cost money. A day lost to snow was a day of wages with no work done. A cart stuck in mud meant hiring extra hands to free it. The weather was not a topic of conversation or a source of beauty. It was an expense line, and Giovanni Battista treated it accordingly. In the evenings, by firelight, Giovanni Battista did his figuring. You see this in the neat columns of numbers that fill the margins, the calculations of how much the month had cost and how much remained in the chest. He added and subtracted, carried over totals from previous pages, estimated what the coming months would require. Sometimes he made mistakes, and you see the crossings out and recalculations that followed. Sometimes he sat for a long time staring at a number that didn't feel right, and you see the note he finally wrote. This cannot be correct, but I have checked it 3 times and it is. The numbers didn't always cooperate. They didn't always add up the way they should. But Giovanni Battista kept adding anyway, kept trying to force order onto a world that resisted order at every turn. The last entry of January each year was always the same. Remaining cash in the chest, counted today, total follows. And then a number, sometimes large, sometimes frighteningly small. In 1547, the number was 112 florins, a comfortable cushion, enough to buy seed and pay wages and still have something left for emergencies. In 1553, the number was 8 florins, barely enough for a week's expenses, and Giovanni Battista must have lain awake that night wondering how he would make it through to the harvest. You don't see that worry in the ledger, of course. You just see the number, sitting there at the bottom of the page, telling its own story. January ends, and February begins, and the work continues. More pruning, more mending, more counting. The days grow longer, imperceptibly at first, then noticeably as the month wears on. The frost softens. The ground begins to wake. And Giovanni Battista, sitting at his table with the ledger open before him, dips his pen and writes the first entry of a new month, a new page, another small victory over the chaos that always waited just outside the door. You run your finger down the pages of spring, and the names begin to stand out from the numbers. Giovanni Battista recorded his workers with the same care he gave to everything else, listing who worked, how long, and what they were paid. But names are different from numbers. Names have weight. Names make you pause and wonder about the faces behind them. And as you read through the decades, you start to know these people, these men and women who bent their backs in Giovanni Battista's vineyard year after year, whose labor turned his hillside into wine and whose lives left traces in the ink of his ledger. There's Tommaso, called Illinois Rosso for his red hair, who appears in the earliest pages and keeps appearing for 30 years. He started as a boy chasing birds from the grapes, then graduated to pruning, then to harvesting, then to leading the other workers in the busiest seasons. Giovanni Battista paid him more than the others. You notice, not much more, but consistently a few soldi extra per day. Tommaso could read, or at least recognize numbers, because there's an entry where Giovanni Battista notes paid Tommaso and he checked the amount himself and agreed. In a world where most laborers took whatever they were given, Tommaso's literacy set him apart. He probably became a kind of foreman, the man Giovanni Battista trusted to keep the others working when the owner was in Florence or sick in bed. Then there's La Pina, short for Giuseppina, who appears in the accounts only occasionally but always in ways that catch your attention. She was paid for washing, for helping in the kitchen during the harvest, for tending to Giovanni Battista's wife during an illness. She was a widow, you learn from a note. Paid La Pina, her husband having died last winter, extra for the heavy work because she has no one to help her now. The ledger doesn't say what happened to her husband, whether he was killed in an accident or taken by fever or simply worn out by 40 years of labor. But you see her there, year after year, taking whatever work she could get, raising whatever children she had, surviving in a world that gave widows very few options. The brothers appear together often, Matteo and Jacopo, who worked as a team and apparently argued constantly. Giovanni Battista notes one year that he paid Matteo and Jacopo separately because they cannot agree on how to divide their wages, and I am tired of their fighting. Another year, he records that Matteo did not work today because Jacopo broke his hoe over Matteo's head and Matteo is nursing a lump the size of an egg. You smile at that one, imagining the brothers in the vineyard. They're echoing across the hillside, their mother probably wishing she'd had daughters instead. But they worked hard when they weren't trying to kill each other, and Giovanni Battista put up with them because good labor was hard to find and harder to keep. The women workers are harder to trace because they are often listed without names. La Mogli di Tomoso or La Figlia della Pina. They appeared during the harvest mostly, when extra hands were needed and anyone who could walk and carry a basket was pressed into service. You see them in the entries for September and October, working alongside the men, their wages recorded in the same columns but often slightly lower. This was normal for the time, you know, but it still rankles, still makes you wish Giovanni Battista had been just a little more equitable in his accounting. He paid what the market demanded, what custom allowed, and if that meant women earned less for the same work, he didn't question it. Neither did they. Probably. They just took their coins and went home to feed their children. The children themselves appear in the ledger too, usually in the margins. The boy Antonio brought water to the workers today, paid him in bread and an egg. Little Maria helped her mother in the kitchen during the pressing, gave her a rag doll I found at the market in Florence, cost nothing but she was pleased. Giovanni Battista was not sentimental, but he wasn't cruel either. He noticed the children, knew their names, kept track of their small contributions and their even smaller rewards. Some of those children grew up to work in the vineyard themselves, their names appearing years later in the same pages where their parents' names had been. You watch generations pass in the space of a few hundred pages, the same families working the same land, their lives circling the same seasons year after year. There are workers who appear only once, then vanish. A man named Stefano who came through looking for work in the summer of 1552, stayed for 3 weeks, then left without collecting his final wages. Giovanni Battista notes this with evident annoyance. Stefano departed in the night, owed him 12 soldi for the last week. If he returns I will pay him, but I doubt he will. What drove Stefano away? Was he running from something, or toward something? Did he ever come back for those 12 soldi? The ledger doesn't say. And you're left with the mystery of a man who passed through this story for a moment and then disappeared, leaving only this small debt behind. The shepherds appear seasonally, driving their flocks down from the mountains in winter and back up in spring. You know them only by their first names and their reputations. Bartolo the shepherd, who cheated me last year on the cheese count but whose sheep are healthy and whose manure is good. The young shepherd from Mangona, new this year, seems honest but time will tell. Giovanni Battista negotiated with them, argued with them, traded wine and oil for wool and cheese, and recorded it all with the same precision he brought to everything else. These men lived on the margins of settled life, their world defined by flocks and pastures and the slow movement of animals across the landscape. They come into the ledger, stay for a few pages, then move on, leaving only their names behind. The specialist workers appear less frequently but command higher wages. The blacksmith, who could shoe a mule or mend a plough in ways ordinary men couldn't. The carpenter, who rebuilt the wine press when it broke and whose work had to last or the whole harvest would be lost. The mason, who repaired the walls and whose stonework Giovanni Battista inspected with a critical eye. These men traveled from farm to farm, village to village, selling their skills where they were needed. You see them in the ledger as visitors, outsiders, Men who didn't belong to the vineyard the way Tommaso and La Pina did. They came, they worked, they were paid, they left. And Giovanni Battista recorded it all. Because even a visitor's labor had to be accounted for. The workers had their own lives, their own families, their own small plots of land where they grew vegetables and kept chickens and maybe a pig. Giovanni Battista knew about these plots because he sometimes bought vegetables from the workers, or paid them in kind with wine and oil that they couldn't produce themselves. You see these exchanges recorded too. Gave Tommaso 2 flasks of wine in exchange for a basket of beans from his garden. Bought a chicken from La Pina for the priest's dinner, paid her 3 soldi. The vineyard and the workers' gardens existed in a kind of symbiosis, each supplying what the other lacked, and Giovanni Battista kept track of it all because that's what he did. On Sundays, the workers went to Mass in the village church, the same church where Giovanni Battista sat in his family's pew and listened to the same priest. You wonder if they acknowledged each other there, if Tommaso tipped his cap to the owner and Giovanni Battista nodded back, or if they maintained the distance that money and status required. The ledger doesn't say. But you like to think that on Sunday, at least, they were all just people in the presence of something larger than themselves, equal in the eyes of God if nowhere else. The last entry for many of these workers is simply their death. Tommaso Illinois Rosso died today, after a short illness. He worked for me for 32 years. I will miss him. That's all. No payment for the funeral. No note about his family, just the bare fact of his passing recorded in the same hand that had recorded his wages for 3 decades. But that one sentence, that small acknowledgement, tells you more than any lengthy tribute could. Tommaso mattered. Giovanni Battista noticed that he mattered. And in this ledger, in this dry book of accounts, he made sure that mattering would be remembered. April arrives in the ledger with a flurry of activity, and you feel the tension building beneath the numbers. Spring was the dangerous season, the time when everything could go wrong and usually did. Giovanni Battista knew this, had lived through enough springs to understand that the vineyard's fate hung on the whims of weather and disease and luck. You see it in his handwriting as the pages turn. The entries grow longer, more detailed, more anxious. He was watching, always watching, and writing down everything he saw. The first sign of trouble comes in the 2nd week of April, 1548. Notice some of the young leaves have spots today. Black spots, spreading fast. Sent for the priest to bless the vines, though I doubt it will help. That last phrase is crossed out, but you can still read it beneath the line Giovanni Battista drew through it. He didn't want to commit blasphemy to paper, apparently, but he thought it, and the thought survived his censorship. The spots were probably powdery mildew, the scourge of vineyards then and now, a fungus that could turn a promising crop to rot in a matter of days. Giovanni Battista bought sulfur, had it ground fine, and sent workers through the rows with bellows to dust the leaves. The entry for sulfur purchases spikes in bad years, drops in good ones, and you can track the health of the vineyard simply by following that one expense line. The hailstorm of 1551 appears without warning. May 12th. A storm came from the west around midday. Hail the size of olives. Destroyed half the young grapes in the upper vineyard. The rest are damaged but may recover. I walked the rows afterward and wanted to weep. That last sentence stops you cold. Giovanni Battista never wrote about weeping. He wrote about expenses and income and the price of nails. But here, in this single entry, the mask slips. A man stood in his vineyard, surrounded by shredded leaves and broken canes, and he wanted to cry. You see him there, the hail melting at his feet, the sky still gray with retreating clouds, and you understand something about him that all the numbers in the world couldn't convey. The response to disaster was always the same. Work. Giovanni Battista hired extra hands to prune away the damaged parts, to prop up the broken canes, to do whatever could be done to salvage something from the wreckage. He bought more sulfur, more copper sulfate, more of whatever remedies the age offered. He recorded every expense, every hour, every desperate attempt to cheat fate. And sometimes it worked. The vines recovered, put out new growth, produced a small but usable crop. Other times it didn't, and the entries for those years trail off into silence, the pages left blank where the harvest accounts should have been. Drought was a different kind of disaster, slower but just as deadly. You see it coming in the spring of 1559, when the entries start noting the lack of rain. March 20th. No rain for 3 weeks now. The ground is powder. The young vines look thirsty. April 3rd. Still no rain. Carrying water from the stream to the most vulnerable plants. The men are exhausted. April 18th. A little rain last night. Not enough. The stream is low. The priest led a procession for rain. I went with him. Giovanni Battista, marching through the village behind a cross, praying for water like his workers prayed for bread. The image stays with you. The nobleman and the laborious united by the one thing they couldn't control. The stream appears often in these spring entries, a thin ribbon of water that wound through the lower part of the property. Giovanni Battista had rights to it, rights that were recorded somewhere in a legal document he probably kept in the same chest as his money. But rights didn't matter when the stream ran dry, or when upstream farmers diverted it for their own thirsty crops. You see the disputes recorded in the margins. Confronted the farmer from up the valley today. He has built a small dam and left me with nothing. He claims he didn't know I needed the water. He lies. I will see the magistrate. Whether he actually saw the magistrate, whether anything came of it, the ledger doesn't say. But you notice that the following year, Giovanni Battista bought a copy of the local water regulations, and you suspect he was preparing for the next fight. The animals suffered too in bad springs. The sheep, still grazing in the lower fields, grew thin when the grass didn't grow. The oxen, needed for plowing and hauling, required extra feed when the pastures failed. Giovanni Battista recorded these costs with a kind of grim resignation, knowing that animals were like vines. They needed what they needed, and if you couldn't provide it, they died. You see entries for extra hay bought at great expense because the pasture is bare, and medicines for the ox who ate something bad in the woods and nearly died. The ox lived. You learn from a later note. The medicines cost more than the ox was worth, but Giovanni Battista paid anyway, because an ox wasn't just an expense line. An ox was a partner in the work, a living creature you couldn't simply replace. The priest appears frequently in these spring disasters, usually at the end of a long list of failed remedies. Giovanni Battista was a practical man, but he was also a man of his time. And when everything else failed, he turned to God. He paid for masses, for blessings, for processions and prayers and all the rituals the church offered against the chaos of the natural world. You see these expenses recorded alongside the sulfur and the extra labor and the medicines for sick animals, as if prayer were just another tool in the struggle for survival. And maybe it was. Maybe, for Giovanni Battista, the priest's blessing was no different from the blacksmith's new plow. Something you bought because you needed it, because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing was never an option. The worst spring in the ledger is 1565. You know this because Giovanni Battista wrote Annus Horribilis at the top of the page, in Latin, as if Italian wasn't strong enough for what he needed to say. The hailstorm came in April, worse than 1551, destroying not just the young grapes but the canes themselves, stripping the vines bare. Then the mildew set in, thriving in the damp that followed the storm. turning even the surviving leaves to blackened rot. Then the stream flooded, washing out a section of the lower vineyard and leaving behind a layer of gravel where the soil used to be. Then the ox died, the old one, the one Giovanni Battista had worked with for 15 years. Then his wife fell ill, and the doctor came from Florence, and the medicines cost more than a month's wages. And through it all, Giovanni Battista wrote, filling page after page with the accumulating disaster, recording every loss because that was the only way he knew to endure them. You read that spring slowly, feeling the weight of it settle onto your own shoulders. The entries grow shorter as the weeks pass, the handwriting more ragged. By June, Giovanni Battista seems barely able to form the letters. Today I walked the vineyard. There is nothing left. I do not know what we will do. That's the last entry for a week. The next page is blank. Then, finally, a single line. The priest came. We talked. He says God tests those he loves. I would rather he loved someone else. It's the closest Giovanni Battista ever comes to despair. And you sit with it for a long moment. This confession from a man who spent his life hiding behind numbers. But the ledger doesn't end there. The next page shows entries for July, for August, for the slow work of recovery. Giovanni Battista bought new vines, planted them in the ruined sections, paid workers to rebuild the terraces the flood had washed away. He borrowed money, sold some land he'd hoped to keep, did whatever had to be done. The vineyard survived, as vineyards do, as people do, by putting one foot in front of the other until the disaster recedes into memory. And Giovanni Battista wrote it all down, because that's who he was, that's what he did. He wrote, and the world kept turning, and the grapes kept growing, and somehow, against all odds, the numbers added up again. May brings something unexpected to the ledger, something that makes you smile as you read it. The sheep have arrived, Giovanni Battista writes, as if announcing visiting royalty. And in a way, he was. The sheep were not just animals. They were a mobile fertilizer factory, a wool supply, a cheese dairy on legs. And they came with their own shepherds, their own dogs, their own ancient traditions of transhumance that had shaped the Italian landscape for thousands of years. You follow the sheep through the pages, watching them transform the vineyard in ways Giovanni Battista recorded with his usual precision and an unusual touch of affection. The shepherds appeared first, walking down from the mountains with their flocks in late spring, after the worst of the rains had passed. Giovanni Battista negotiated with them every year, the terms written carefully in the margin. Agreed with the shepherd Marco for his flock of 200 sheep to graze the lower fields and the fallow land. Payment of 12 cheeses at the end of their stay, plus the manure, which is the real payment anyway. The manure. Always the manure. Giovanni Battista understood that sheep were walking bags of gold, leaving their treasure scattered across the land with every step. He calculated the value of that manure against the cost of the cheese, the risk of the sheep damaging young vines, the labor of moving them from field to field. It was all there in the numbers, the ancient arithmetic of agriculture that hadn't changed since the Romans. The sheep arrived in a cloud of dust and bleating, their bells clanking in a rhythm that carried across the hillside. Giovanni Battista recorded their arrival each year with a kind of ritual formality. The flock entered the lower pasture today. Counted them as they passed, 197, which is 3 fewer than Marco claimed. He admitted the loss and adjusted his price. We all agreed. 3 sheep lost to wolves, or disease, or simply wandering off into the woods and never returning. Marco the shepherd probably mourned them privately, but in the ledger they were just numbers, adjustments, variables in an equation that had to balance before any cheese changed hands. The dogs came with the sheep, fierce, shaggy creatures bred to fight wolves and ignore everyone except their shepherds. Giovanni Battista mentions them only when they cause trouble. One of Marco's dogs bit Tommaso today while he was mending the fence. Tommaso is angry and wants compensation. I gave him a flask of wine and promised to speak to Marco. The dog is lucky Tommaso didn't kill it. You imagine the scene. Tommaso, bleeding and cursing. The dog slinking away with the shepherd shouting after it. Giovanni Battista standing in the middle trying to keep the peace. In the end, everyone calmed down. The dog was tied up, and the work continued. But the entry remains, a small reminder that even the most useful animals could be a pain in the neck. The sheep moved through the vineyard in a carefully managed rotation. First the lower fields, where the grass grew thickest and the vines were still too young to need protection. Then the fallow land, the fields resting between plantings, where the sheep could graze to their heart's content and leave their manure to enrich the soil for next year's crops. Then the olive grove, where they kept the grass down and saved Giovanni Battista the labor of mowing. And finally, if the shepherd agreed and the fences held, they might graze between the rows of mature vines, nibbling the weeds that competed with the grapes for water and nutrients. Giovanni Battista recorded each move, each negotiation with Marco about where the sheep could go and for how long. It was like watching a slow, woolly dance across the hillside. The sheep brought other benefits besides manure. They produced milk, which the shepherds turned into cheese in portable huts they set up at the edge of the pasture. Giovanni Battista bought some of this cheese, paid Marco for 10 pounds of fresh cheese, to be eaten now, and 10 pounds of aged cheese, to be kept for winter. He recorded the price, the quality, his opinion of Marco's cheese-making skills. The cheese is good this year, he notes in 1557. Marco's wife makes it, and she has a better hand than he does. The shepherds' wives and daughters appear occasionally in these entries, usually in connection with food, cheese, bread, sometimes a stew made from an old sheep that couldn't make the journey back to the mountains. They were part of the transaction too, though they never appear in the accounts directly. The sheep also produced wool, which Giovanni Battista sometimes bought for his household's use. Purchased enough wool from Marco's shearing to make new cloaks for myself and my son. The price was fair, the wool soft. Marco says it comes from the black sheep, which is supposed to be warmer. You picture Giovanni Battista in his new black cloak, walking the vineyard in the winter, the wool keeping out the cold that seeped up from the ground. The cloak would last for years, would be passed down or sold or finally worn to rags, and somewhere in its fibers would be the memory of Marco's sheep, grazing between the vines in a long-ago spring. But the sheep weren't always welcome. When they got into the wrong place, the trouble began. The sheep broke through the fence last night and got into the young vines. Ate the leaves off 20 plants before Marco noticed. He is sorry, he says, but sorry doesn't replace the leaves. I will deduct from his cheese payment. The fence was mended, the damage assessed, the deduction applied. Giovanni Battista recorded it all with a kind of weary resignation, as if he'd known all along that something would go wrong and was just waiting to find out what. The sheep, for their part, probably didn't notice the drama they'd caused. They just ate what was in front of them, as sheep do, and moved on. The shepherds themselves were a source of both utility and concern. They lived apart from the settled world, speaking their own dialect, following their own customs, marrying among themselves in ways that made villagers suspicious. Giovanni Battista treated them with a mixture of respect and wariness, recording their arrivals and departures, their debts and payments, their occasional conflicts with his workers. One of Marco's men got into a fight with Jacopo today. Something about a woman, I gather. I separated them and sent the shepherd back to his flock. Jacopo's head is bleeding, but he will live. The shepherd was probably used to such conflicts, used to being the outsider, the one who moved through other people's land and left only footprints and manure behind. At the end of the summer, the sheep departed. Giovanni Battista recorded the farewell with the same ritual formality as the arrival. The flock left today, bound for the mountains. Counted them as they passed, 193, which is 4 fewer than when they arrived. Marco says wolves got 2, 1 died of sickness, 1 wandered off and never returned. I believe him. He is honest. For a shepherd. Paid him his cheese and sent him on his way. The sheep vanished over the hills, their bells fading into silence, and the vineyard settled back into its routine. But something remained. The manure in the soil, the memory of their passing in the ledger, the small mark they left on the land and on Giovanni Battista's careful accounts. You think about those sheep as you turn the page, about the rhythm of their coming and going that structured the year as surely as the pruning and the harvest. They were visitors, guests, temporary residents in a world that belonged to the vines. But for a few months each year, they transformed the place, fertilizing the soil, cropping the grass, filling the air with their bleating and the clank of their bells. And Giovanni Battista, sitting at his table with the ledger open before him, recorded it all. Because that's what he did. That's what he always did. August settles over the ledger like a weight, the pages seeming to radiate heat even after 4 centuries. You feel it in the entries themselves. Shorter, more urgent, obsessed with water and shade and the slow torture of watching grapes shrivel on the vine. Giovanni Battista wrote through these summers with a kind of desperate attention, noting every cloud that passed, every hint of rain that never came, every small death in the vineyard that added up to disaster. You read these pages carefully, because this is where the story becomes visceral, where the numbers translate directly into suffering. The drought of 1559 returns to the pages, and you follow it day by day through the worst August Giovanni Battista ever recorded. August 1st. No rain for 6 weeks now. The grapes are small, hard. Some are turning brown and falling off. I walk the rows every morning and find more damage. August 3rd. The stream is a trickle. We are drawing water from the well for the vines nearest the house, carrying it in buckets. The men are exhausted by midday. August 7th. A few clouds this afternoon, but they passed without rain. The animals are suffering too. The pigs are listless. The chickens stop laying. Even the dogs lie in the shade and won't move. You feel the heat coming off the page, the shimmer of it, the way it pressed down on everything and everyone until movement itself became an act of courage. Giovanni Battista tried everything. He bought water from a neighbor whose well ran deeper, paying by the barrel and recording the cost with grim precision. He sent workers to the river, hours away, to fill casks and bring them back on the ox cart. He built temporary shades over the most valuable vines, using cloth he'd bought for the purpose and praying it would help. He even tried something you don't expect. Today I had the men smear clay on the south-facing sides of the vine trunks. The old people say it protects against the sun. I don't know if it works, but it gives us something to do. The old people were right, as old people often are. The clay reflected some of the heat, kept the bark from cracking, gave the vines a fighting chance. But in a drought like this one, fighting chances were all anyone had. The grapes themselves told the story. In good years, Giovanni Battista recorded their progress with satisfaction. The Sangioves are swelling nicely, should be ready by late September. In bad years, the entries grew more anxious. The grapes are not swelling. They are shrinking. Some have turned to raisins on the vine. The wasps are getting them. The wasps appeared when the grapes split or dried, drawn by the sweetness that was supposed to become wine but was instead becoming insect food. Giovanni Battista fought them too, setting traps, burning sulfur to drive them away, even hiring boys with switches to stand in the vineyard and wave at the swarms. It didn't work, of course. Nothing worked. The wasps took what they wanted, and Giovanni Battista recorded the loss and moved on. The heat affected everything, not just the vines. The workers slowed down, started later in the day, stopped earlier, took longer breaks in whatever shade they could find. Giovanni Battista noted these adjustments with understanding. The men cannot work through the midday heat. I have agreed they may rest from noon until the late afternoon, then work until dusk. It costs me the same wages for less work, but there is no choice. He didn't like it. You can tell from the tone. Every soldi spent on wages that didn't produce results was a wound to his careful calculations. But he accepted it, because he was there too, feeling the same heat, knowing that no amount of money could make a man work when his body was shutting down from the temperature. The animals suffered most visibly. The ox, always the ox, appears in these summer entries with heartbreaking regularity. The ox is suffering. He stands in the stream when we let him, but the stream is barely enough to wet his hooves. I gave him extra water from the well, but he is listless and will not eat. The ox died today. I knew it was coming, but still it is a blow. He worked for me for 12 years. Now I must find money for another. And this is the worst time to buy because everyone needs oxen in the drought. The death of the ox was more than a financial loss. It was the death of a companion, a creature Giovanni Battista had fed and cared for and depended on for more than a decade. He doesn't say that in the ledger, of course. He just records the cost of replacing it and moves on. But you feel it anyway, the weight of that loss pressing down on the numbers. The nights brought no relief. Giovanni Battista notes this too. The heat does not leave at night. I lie awake, sweating, listening to the animals stir restlessly in their stalls. The grapes do not cool as they should. They will not recover. The vines needed cool nights to recover from the heat of the day, to slow their respiration and build the sugars that would become alcohol. Without that coolness, they just cooked slowly, day after day, until there was nothing left but shriveled skins and bitter seeds. Giovanni Battista understood this, understood the biology of it even if he couldn't explain it in modern terms. He watched the thermometer of his own body and knew what it meant for the grapes. The neighbors appear in these summer entries too, usually in connection with water. Today I argued with the farmer from upstream about the stream. He has taken more than his share. He says because his crops need it. My crops need it too, I told him. He laughed. He has a better claim, he says, because his land was granted water rights 100 years ago. I will check the records, but I suspect he is right. The law favors those who have been here longest. This was the reality of drought. It turned neighbors into enemies, water into a weapon, and ancient documents into instruments of survival. Giovanni Battista checked the records, found a farmer was right, and had to accept less water for his vines. He recorded it all, the injustice and the resignation, in the same flat tone he used for everything else. The priest came again in August, not for processions this time but for private prayers. Giovanni Battista records these visits with a mixture of hope and skepticism. The priest came today and prayed over the vineyard. He says God will provide. I want to believe him. But God has not provided yet, and the grapes continue to die. You wonder if the priest believed his own words, or if he was just doing his job, offering comfort where no comfort was possible. Either way, Giovanni Battista paid him, because that's what you did when the priest came. You paid, and you prayed, and you hoped that this time the prayers would work. The crisis broke in late August, as crises sometimes do. A storm came from the sea, pushed across the hills, and dumped rain on the parched vineyard for 2 solid days. Giovanni Battista recorded it with an excitement that breaks through his usual restraint. Rain. Finally, rain. It started in the night and continued through today. The ground drank it like a thirsty animal. The vines are reviving before my eyes. I stood in it, let it soak me, and thanked God and the saints and anyone else who might be listening. The rain saved the vintage, though it was too late for the grapes that had already died. What remained swelled quickly, ripened in the cooler weather that followed, and produced a small but usable crop. Giovanni Battista recorded the harvest with relief, with gratitude, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had stared down disaster and somehow survived. You close the August pages and sit for a moment, feeling the ghost of that heat, that desperation, that final release of rain. The ledger has taken you through drought before, but never like this, never with such intimate detail, such day-by-day accounting of loss and hope and loss again. Giovanni Battista survived, and the vineyard survived, and you realize that's the whole story, really. Not triumph, not tragedy, just survival. Day after day, year after year. One foot in front of the other until the crisis passed and the world returned to something like normal. And through it all, the writing continued, the numbers accumulated, the record grew. Because that's what Giovanni Battista did. That's what he always did. September arrives in the ledger like a held breath finally released. The harvest was coming. You could feel it in the entries, the way they shifted from anxious watching to frantic preparation. Giovanni Battista wrote through these days with a different kind of energy, quicker, more decisive, the hand moving faster across the page as if there wasn't enough time to record everything that needed recording. You follow him through the final weeks before the harvest, feeling the tension build, knowing that everything he'd worked for all year would be decided in the space of a few weeks. The preparations began in early September, with the equipment. Brought the baskets up from the cellar today, counted them, mended those that needed mending. We have 87 baskets in good condition, which should be enough if the crop is average. Checked the wine press, greased the screw, replaced 2 ropes that looked worn. The carpenter came to look at the beam, says it is sound. Washed all the fermentation vats with hot water and vinegar, scrubbed them myself to be sure they were clean. Giovanni Battista trusted no one with these final preparations. You notice. He inspected everything personally, touched everything, made sure that when the grapes came in, everything would be ready to receive them. The workers were organized too. Giovanni Battista listed them in the ledger, name by name, noting who would do what. Tommaso will lead the pickers in the upper vineyard, as he always does. Matteo and Jacopo will carry baskets to the press, assuming they can stop fighting long enough to work. La Pina will help in the kitchen, feeding everyone, and her daughter will bring water to the pickers. The whole community gathered for the harvest, everyone who could walk and carry a basket pressed into service. Giovanni Battista calculated how many pickers he needed, how many baskets they could fill in a day, how long the harvest would take. It was logistics, pure and simple, the kind of planning that made the difference between a good harvest and a disaster. The weather in September was always a concern, and Giovanni Battista watched it like a hawk. Fair today, warm but not too hot. The grapes are ripening nicely. Clouds this morning, but they burned off. Still hoping for dry weather until the harvest is in. Rain forecast for next week. We must hurry. The rain was the enemy now, not the friend it had been in August. Rain on ripe grapes could split them, rot them, turn a perfect vintage into moldy mush in a matter of hours. Giovanni Battista watched the sky, consulted the old men who claimed they could read the weather in the flight of birds, and made his decisions accordingly. When to start, when to stop, when to push the workers faster and when to let them rest. It was all there in the ledger, the anxiety and the calculation and the hope. The harvest itself began on a date Giovanni Battista recorded with special care. September 24th, 1558. Began the harvest today. The grapes are perfect, small, sweet, with thick skins that will give good color to the wine. I walked through the vineyard this morning and tasted a dozen berries. They are the best I have seen in years. You can hear the satisfaction in that entry. The quiet pride of a man who had done everything right and was about to be rewarded. He walked through the vines that morning, picking grapes at random, rolling them on his tongue, judging their sugar and acid and tannin with the experience of decades. They were perfect, and he wrote it down because that's what he did. The pickers moved through the rows, filling baskets, calling out to each other, their voices carrying across the hillside. Giovanni Battista recorded their progress in the ledger, hour by hour sometimes, noting how many baskets came in, how full they were, how many grapes were lost to birds or rot or simple clumsiness. By midday, we had filled 43 baskets. Tommaso says the upper vineyard is yielding better than expected. The grapes there are larger, maybe because they got more shade during the drought. Evening count, 8 to 7 baskets. A good day's work. The men are tired but satisfied. I gave them extra wine with their supper. The baskets came to the pressing shed, where another crew waited to receive them. Giovanni Battista recorded this process too. The endless transformation of grapes into juice. Dumped the first baskets into the press today. The juice ran dark and sweet. The smell is everywhere. That smell of harvest that I have known since I was a boy. The smell of crushed grapes, of fermenting juice, of the year's work finally coming to fruition. It filled the shed, the courtyard, the whole hillside, drawing wasps and bees and children who came to suck the sweet pulp from discarded skins. Giovanni Battista breathed it in and wrote it down, because even smells had their place in his accounting. The press worked steadily, its great beam creaking as it descended onto the baskets of grapes. Giovanni Battista watched it like a mother watching a child, noting every sound, every movement, every potential problem. The press is working well, though the screw needs greasing more often than I expected. I will have the blacksmith look at it after the harvest. One of the ropes broke today, but we had a spare and the loss of time was small. I will buy 2 new ropes for next year, so we have backups. The press was the heart of the operation, and Giovanni Battista treated it accordingly. He recorded its needs, its failures, its moments of perfect function, building a portrait of a machine that was almost alive in its importance. The fermentation began almost immediately, the juice bubbling in the vats as the wild yeasts did their work. Giovanni Battista recorded this too, though with less certainty. The must is fermenting strongly. It smells good, but you never know until it's done. Some years it goes wrong, turns to vinegar, and all that work is wasted. He tasted it daily, watching the bubbles, judging the color and the smell, waiting for the moment when fermentation slowed and the wine began to clarify. It was a nervous time, this waiting, because so much could still go wrong. But Giovanni Battista had done it before, many times, and he trusted his senses and his experience to guide him through. The numbers accumulated as the harvest progressed. Baskets picked, baskets pressed, gallons of juice, projected gallons of wine. Giovanni Battista added them up each night, comparing them to previous years, calculating what the final total might be. After 5 days, we have pressed 312 baskets. That should yield about 40 barrels of wine, if all goes well. Better than last year, not as good as the best years, but respectable. Respectable. That was the word he used, and you could hear the satisfaction in it. Not a record harvest, not a disaster, just respectable. After everything, the drought, the hail, the constant struggle, respectable was enough. The workers received their harvest wages, recorded in the ledger with the same precision as everything else. Paid Tommaso for 8 days of harvest work, 3 soldi per day, total 24 soldi. Paid Matteo and Jacopo the same, though they argued about who worked harder. Paid La Pina for cooking during the harvest, 2 soldi per day, plus the leftovers which are customary. Paid the extra pickers, mostly women and children, at varying rates depending on what they did. The money changed hands, the workers went home, the harvest was done. And Giovanni Battista sat in his kitchen, adding up the final totals, calculating what the wine would sell for, what he would owe in tithes and taxes, what would be left for himself and his family. The last entry for the harvest is always the same, year after year. The harvest is complete. The wine is in the barrels. Now we wait. That's all. 4 centuries later, you read those words and feel the exhaustion behind them, the relief, the quiet satisfaction of work completed. Giovanni Battista closed the ledger, blew out the candle, and went to bed. Tomorrow there would be more work, more entries, more numbers to record. But tonight, just for a moment, the harvest was in, the wine was made, and everything was as it should be. October settles over the ledger like a sigh of relief, but the work isn't done. The wine sits in barrels now, fermenting its way toward drinkability, and Giovanni Battista turns his attention to the other great obligation of the season, the tithe. You watch him calculate what the church is owed, and you see the numbers take on a different kind of weight. This wasn't just accounting. This was duty, obligation, the price of belonging to a world where God and money were permanently intertwined. The tithe was 1/10 of the harvest, theoretically. In practice, it was whatever the church could claim and Giovanni Battista could negotiate. You see the negotiations in the ledger, the back and forth between the vineyard owner and the priest who came to assess the crop. The priest came today to estimate the tithe. He walked the vineyard, looked at the barrels, tasted the new wine. He says we owe 12 barrels. I argued for 10. We settled on 11, plus a small cask for his personal use. That small cask was the grease that made the negotiation work, the unofficial payment that smoothed the official one. Giovanni Battista recorded it without comment, as if it were just another expense, which it was. The priest appears often in these October entries, and you begin to form a picture of him. He was probably a local man, born in the village or somewhere nearby, educated just enough to say Mass and keep basic records. He depended on tithes like Giovanni Battista's for his living, so he had to be careful, not so greedy that the farmers rebelled, not so lenient that he starved. Giovanni Battista respected him, you think, or at least tolerated him. They shared a world, these two men, one concerned with souls and the other with soil, and they found ways to work together even when their interests conflicted. The tithe wasn't just wine. It was oil, grain, cheese, anything the vineyard produced that could be eaten or sold. Giovanni Battista listed it all, calculating the value of each item, making sure the total came to the required 1/10. Paid the tithe in oil this year, because the wine is less than expected and we need it for our own use. 40 pounds of oil, which the priest accepted though he would have preferred wine. The priest probably traded that oil for things he needed, or sold it, or used it in the lamps that lit his church. However it was used, Giovanni Battista recorded it, and the obligation was met, and the world continued on its ordained path. But the tithe wasn't the only religious expense in October. There were also the offerings, the candles, the masses for the dead. Giovanni Battista's parents appear in these entries, their anniversaries marked by payments for prayers that would ease their passage through purgatory. October 15th, the anniversary of my father's death. Paid the priest to say a mass for his soul, 1 florin. May he rest in peace. You wonder if Giovanni Battista believed in purgatory, if he really thought his father was suffering somewhere and needed the prayers of the living to escape, or if this was just custom, something you did because everyone did it, because the alternative was unthinkable. The ledger doesn't say. It just records the payment, the date, the purpose, and moves on. The church building itself required maintenance, and the parishioners were expected to contribute. Giovanni Battista recorded these contributions with the same precision as everything else. Paid for new roof tiles on the church, my share being 3 florins. The roof was leaking and the priest complained every Sunday. Contributed to the purchase of a new altar cloth, 2 soldi. The old one was stained and the women of the parish were embarrassed. These were not tithes, not obligations in the strict sense, but Giovanni Battista paid them anyway because that's what you did. You supported your church, your community, the institutions that held the world together. The poor appear in October too, more frequently than in other months. Perhaps the approach of winter made their need more visible, or perhaps the harvest made charity easier to afford. Giovanni Battista recorded his gifts with a kind of routine precision. Gave bread to 3 poor families at the gate today, 2 loaves each. Paid for a pair of shoes for a child whose parents died in the summer fever, 4 soldi. Let a poor woman sleep in the stable last night. It was cold and she had nowhere to go. These were not tax-deductible donations, not strategic philanthropy. They were just the things you did when you had a little extra and someone else had nothing. Giovanni Battista recorded them because he recorded everything. But you get the sense that he didn't expect anything in return. The gift was its own reward. Or maybe the reward was simply the right to sleep at night without thinking about the woman who had nowhere to go. The wine itself was a kind of currency in these exchanges. Giovanni Battista gave it to the priest, to the poor, to neighbors who helped with the harvest, to travelers who stopped at his door. He recorded these gifts as expenses, because that's what they were. Wine that could have been sold, given away instead. Gave a flask of new wine to the widow Bensi, whose son helped with the harvest. She was grateful. Gave 2 flasks to the priest for the Christmas Mass, as is customary. Gave a small barrel to the magistrate when he came to settle the boundary dispute. It helped. That last one is telling. The wine didn't just lubricate social relations. It lubricated legal ones too. A gift to the magistrate was not quite a bribe, not quite a courtesy, but something in between, something everyone understood without saying. The question of what the wine was worth runs through all these October entries. Giovanni Battista calculated it constantly, comparing the price he could get at market against the value of keeping it for his own use or giving it away. Sold 10 barrels to a merchant from Florence today, at a good price. He will resell them in the city, where people pay more for wine with a name. Kept 5 barrels for our own use, which is worth something though I don't record it as income. Gave 2 barrels to the church, which is worth less than selling them, but the priest is happy and that has its own value. The numbers only told part of the story. The rest was relationships, obligations, the invisible economy that ran alongside the visible one. Historians still argue whether the medieval and Renaissance economies were fundamentally different from our own, or whether people then thought about money the same way we do. Reading Giovanni Battista's ledger, you come down firmly on the side of both. He thought about money constantly, calculated it obsessively, reduced everything to numbers when he could. But he also understood that some things couldn't be reduced, that a gift to the priest or a flask for the widow had value that didn't appear in any column. He recorded those gifts anyway, because his ledger was not just an account book. It was a record of his life, and his life included things that money couldn't buy. The tithe paid, the offerings made, the gifts distributed. October wound down toward November. Giovanni Battista added up the totals for the month, compared them to previous years, calculated what remained. The numbers told him he had done well, or well enough, or poorly depending on the year. But they didn't tell him everything. They didn't tell him that the priest appreciated his honesty, that the widow slept better knowing he was nearby, that the poor families he fed would remember him when the next hard winter came. Those things weren't in the ledger, but you know they were real. They had to be. No one keeps a ledger for 40 years just to count money. They keep it because the counting itself is a way of caring, a way of paying attention to a world that would otherwise slip away unrecorded. November brings a different kind of entry to the ledger, one that makes you sit up a little straighter as you read. November 11th, the Feast of San Martino. Open the first barrel of new wine today, as is the custom. The workers gathered in the courtyard, and we drank together. It was a good day. You've seen this entry before, in various forms, across multiple years. The Feast of San Martino was the moment when the year's work finally became celebration, when the wine that had been fermenting in the barrels was tasted for the first time, when Giovanni Battista sat down with his workers and drank to the harvest that was and the harvest to come. The preparations for the feast began days before, recorded in the ledger with the same precision as everything else. Bought 2 chickens from La Pina for the feast, paid her 6 soldi. Killed the pig that was not thriving, will roast it for San Martino. Borrowed extra benches from the church for the workers to sit on. The priest says we must return them promptly. Bought chestnuts from the woods, roasted them in the fire. They will go with the wine. These were the components of celebration, the small luxuries that marked the feast as different from ordinary days. Giovanni Battista recorded them all. But you notice that the tone shifts slightly. There's a warmth in these entries, a sense of anticipation, that you don't see in the dry lists of expenses and income. The morning of the feast, the workers gathered in the courtyard. Giovanni Battista recorded their arrival. The men came early, even though no work was expected. They brought their families, wives, children, even a few grandparents who could still walk. La Pina brought her famous bread, which she will not share the recipe for. Tommaso brought a flask of wine from his own small plot, to compare with ours. The whole community assembled, the people who had worked the vineyard through pruning and drought and harvest, now coming together to taste the fruit of their labor. Giovanni Battista stood among them, not as owner but as host, and you can see him there in your mind, moving through the crowd, greeting each person by name. The first barrel was brought up from the cellar, its wooden staves still damp from the cool darkness below. Giovanni Battista recorded the moment, tapped the barrel that held the wine from the upper vineyard, the Sangiovese that ripened so well this year. It ran clear and dark, with a smell that made everyone smile. The smell of new wine, sharp and sweet and full of promise, filled the courtyard. The workers crowded around, cups in hand, waiting for their share. Giovanni Battista filled the first cup himself, tasted it, pronounced it good. Then the pouring began in earnest, cup after cup, the wine flowing like water but tasting like nothing else on earth. The drinking was serious business, but it was also joyful. Giovanni Battista recorded the mood. The wine is good, everyone agrees. There was much laughter, much talk, much remembering of the hard days that are now behind us. Tommaso told the story of the hailstorm again, and everyone groaned, but they laughed too. This was the ritual of the feast, the communal remembering that bound the workers together and reminded them why they endured the hard days. Giovanni Battista listened to the stories, drank his wine, and felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: satisfaction. The year had been good, the wine was good, and for this one day, that was enough. The food came out as the afternoon wore on. Roasted chicken, pork from the pig that wasn't thriving, chestnuts cooked in the embers of the fire, La Pina's famous bread, cheese from the sheep that had grazed in the vineyard back in the spring. Giovanni Battista recorded it all, but the entries are different now. Less precise, more impressionistic. The food was plentiful and everyone ate well. The children especially, who do not often get meat. They will remember this. The children would remember. Yes, they would grow up remembering the feast of San Martino, the taste of roasted meat and new wine, the feeling of being full and warm and part of something larger than themselves. And some of them, years later, would tell their own children about it, keeping the memory alive across generations. The drinking continued into the evening, the cups refilled again and again. Giovanni Battista noted the effects. By evening, many were drunk, including some who should know better. Matteo and Jacopo argued again, but this time it ended in laughter and embraces. Tommaso sang a song his grandfather taught him, about the wine and the women of the village. It was not appropriate, but everyone sang along. The wine loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions, turned arguments into jokes and workers into friends. Giovanni Battista drank too, though probably less than the others. He had to record the day, after all, and it's hard to record when you can't see straight. The priest appeared at some point, drawn by the noise and the smell of roasting meat. Giovanni Battista recorded his arrival with a kind of amused tolerance. The priest came to see what all the noise was about. We gave him wine and food, and he stayed longer than he meant to. He blessed the vineyard and the wine and everyone in sight, then drank more wine and blessed us again. The priest was part of the community too, for all his special status. He blessed and drank and blessed again, and no one minded because that's what priests did, and because the wine was good and the company was better. As darkness fell, the fires were lit. Giovanni Battista recorded this too. We built a fire in the courtyard and sat around it as the night grew cold. The stars came out, bright and sharp. Someone pointed out the constellations, told stories about them. The children listened with wide eyes. The fire drew everyone together, its light pushing back the November dark, its warmth a comfort against the cold that would only deepen in the months ahead. Giovanni Battista sat among his people, looking at the stars, and for a moment, just a moment, he was not the owner of anything. He was just a man, surrounded by other men and women and children, sharing wine and stories and the simple fact of being alive. The feast ended late, or maybe it never really ended. People drifted away in ones and twos, walking home by starlight, their voices carrying across the hillside as they sang or called out to each other. Giovanni Battista recorded the departure. The last of them left around midnight. The courtyard is quiet now. The fire burned down to coals. I am tired, but it is a good tired, the kind that comes from a day well spent. He sat alone by the dying fire, the ledger open on his lap, writing by the last of the light. Tomorrow there would be more work, more entries, more numbers to record. But tonight, just for tonight, there was only this: the memory of wine and laughter, the warmth of community, the quiet satisfaction of a life lived in rhythm with the land. You close the November pages and sit with them for a moment, feeling the echo of that feast across the centuries. The people are gone. The wine is long since drunk, the fire reduced to ashes that scattered long ago. But the ledger remains, and in its pages, the feast of San Martino lives on. Giovanni Battista wrote it down, and you read it, and for a moment, just a moment, you are there too. Sitting by the fire, cup in hand, listening to Tommaso sing a song that was old even then. Part of something larger than yourself. Part of the story. December turns the ledger toward a different kind of entry, one that reveals the cracks in Giovanni Battista's carefully ordered world. You've seen hints of it before. The moved boundary stone, the argument over water, the neighbor who laughed at his claim. But now the dispute takes center stage, spreading across multiple pages in a tangle of accusations and counter-accusations that would test any accountant's patience. This was the battle over 3 feet of land and 5 stolen cuttings, and it consumed months of Giovanni Battista's life and pages of his ledger. It started, as these things often do, with something small. December 3rd, 1562. Went to check the boundary below the wood today and found that the marker stone has been moved again. This is the 3rd time in 2 years. I am certain it is Matteo da Panzano, whose land adjoins mine on that side. He wants the extra space for his new vineyard. Matteo da Panzano appears in the ledger now as a recurring character, a villain in Giovanni Battista's personal drama. He was a neighbor, a fellow landowner, a man who apparently believed that boundaries were suggestions rather than facts. And Giovanni Battista, who believed that boundaries were sacred and records were truth, could not let it stand. The history of the dispute unfolded in the pages that followed. Giovanni Battista recorded every detail, building a case that would hold up in court or in the court of his own mind. The original boundary was set in 1523, when my father bought this land. There is a document, which I have, describing the stone as being at the foot of the large chestnut tree. The chestnut tree is still there. The stone is not. He described the tree, its size and shape, the way its roots spread across the ground. He described the stone, its color and markings, the way it had sat in the same spot for 40 years before Matteo decided to move it. He described the measurements he had taken, the witnesses who remembered the original boundary, the priest who had blessed the stone when it was first placed. Matteo, for his part, had his own version of events. Giovanni Battista recorded it with evident skepticism. Matteo claims the stone was never in that spot, that my father moved it years ago to steal land from his father. He says he has witnesses too, though he will not name them. He says the chestnut tree is not the same chestnut tree, that the original was struck by lightning and this one grew in its place. He says many things. I believe none of them. The 2 versions of reality collided in the space between their properties, each man certain of his rightness, each man prepared to fight for every inch of soil. The legal battle began in earnest in January of 1563. Giovanni Battista recorded the costs, paid the notary to draw up a formal complaint, 3 florins. Paid the messenger to deliver it to the magistrate in Florence, 2 soldi. Paid the magistrate's clerk to file the papers, another florin. The machinery of Renaissance justice ground slowly, and it required constant oiling in the form of fees and bribes and little gifts to the right people. Giovanni Battista paid them all, recording each one, building a mountain of expense that would only be worthwhile if he won. The witnesses came forward, or didn't, depending on their courage and their relationship to the 2 men. Giovanni Battista recorded his efforts to secure testimony. Went to see old Bartolomeo, who worked for my father and remembers the boundary being set. He is afraid to testify, says Matteo threatened him. I promised to protect him. He agreed to speak if necessary. Spoke to the priest, who remembers the blessing of the stone. He is reluctant to get involved, but I reminded him of the wine I gave at Christmas. He will testify if called. The web of obligation and fear that surrounded the dispute grew thicker with each passing month, drawing in more people, creating more complications. The surveyors came next, hired by the magistrate to measure the land and determine the true boundary. Giovanni Battista recorded their arrival with hope. The surveyors came today, 2 men from Florence with instruments I have never seen. They spent hours measuring, comparing their findings to the old documents. They asked many questions, wrote many notes. I fed them well, gave them wine, showed them the chestnut tree. They seemed impressed by my records. The surveyors were professionals, neutral parties in theory, but Giovanni Battista knew that neutrality was a myth. He treated them well, made sure they saw his side of the story, hoped that his meticulous records would tip the balance in his favor. While waiting for the surveyor's report, the dispute took a new turn. December 15th. Discovered today that Matteo has taken cuttings from my best vines, the ones near the disputed boundary. He claims they were on his land, but they were not. He has stolen from me, and I will add this to my complaint. The cuttings were more than just plant material. They were the genetic inheritance of Giovanni Battista's vineyard, the product of decades of selection and care. Matteo had taken them, rooted them in his own soil, and was now growing his own vineyard from Giovanni Battista's hard work. It was theft, pure and simple, and it made the boundary dispute personal in a way that moving a stone never could. The magistrate finally ruled in the spring of 1564. Giovanni Battista recorded the verdict with a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. The magistrate has decided in my favor. The boundary is where I said it was. The stone must be returned to its proper place, and Matteo must pay my legal costs. He is angry, says he will appeal. Let him. I have won. You can feel the relief in that entry, the satisfaction of being vindicated after more than a year of struggle. Giovanni Battista had kept his land, his vines, his honor. The ledger had proven its worth, not just as a record of expenses but as a weapon in the fight for justice. But the story didn't end there. Matteo did appeal, as he had threatened, and the dispute dragged on for another year. Giovanni Battista recorded the additional costs, the additional witnesses, the additional anxiety. Matteo's appeal was heard today. He had no new evidence, only the same lies he told before. The magistrate dismissed it. It is finally over. Finally over. 2 years of conflict, countless florins in legal fees, endless hours of worry and preparation. And at the end of it all, Giovanni Battista had what he had at the beginning: his land, his boundary, his sense of order restored. But something had changed. The dispute had cost him more than money. It had cost him the belief that the world made sense, that boundaries stayed where they were put, that neighbors could be trusted. The cuttings remained a separate issue. Giovanni Battista recorded his solution. Matteo still has the cuttings he stole. I demanded that he dig them up and return them. He refused, saying they are now his vines. The magistrate says there is nothing to be done, that plants become property once they are in the ground. I disagree, but the law is the law. The stolen vines grew on Matteo's land, producing grapes from Giovanni Battista's heritage, and there was nothing he could do about it. Every time he looked at that side of the property, he would see them, a living reminder of the dispute and its imperfect resolution. In the margin of the final entry, Giovanni Battista wrote something that stops you cold. I am tired of fighting. I have won, but I do not feel like a winner. Matteo is my neighbor. I will have to live next to him for the rest of my life. Perhaps I should have let him have the 3 feet. The doubt creeps in at the last moment. The realization that victory in court doesn't always mean victory in life. Giovanni Battista won his boundary, but he lost something too. The ease of neighborly relations, the assumption of goodwill, the simple pleasure of looking across at someone else's land without resentment. You close the December pages and sit with them for a while, thinking about boundaries and disputes and the high cost of being right. Giovanni Battista did what he had to do, what his sense of order demanded. But the ledger, for once, doesn't celebrate. It just records, and leaves you to wonder whether the 3 feet of land were worth the years of conflict. Probably not. You decide. But then, you didn't live in that world, didn't feel that stone being moved inch by inch, didn't watch your vines growing on someone else's land. It's easy to be philosophical from 4 centuries away. Up close, in the moment, you might have fought just as hard. The handwriting changes in 1571, and you feel the shift before you fully understand it. The entries become neater, more regular, but somehow less alive. The little flourishes disappear, the marginal comments vanish, the personality that infused every page for 3 decades simply stops. Giovanni Battista is gone, you realize, or at least his hand is gone, replaced by someone who writes in a careful, professional script that tells you nothing about the person holding the pen. You've reached the end of an era, and the ledger will never be the same. The final entries in Giovanni Battista's own hand appear in late 1570, and you read them slowly, knowing what's coming. October 12th. The harvest is complete. I am very tired this year, more than usual. Perhaps it is age. November 8th. Did not attend the feast of San Martino this year. The doctor says I should rest. The workers came to the house instead, brought me wine and food. They sang outside my window. It was kind. December 1st. I have not been keeping the ledger properly. My son writes most of it now. I check his figures, but my eyes are not what they were. The man who had recorded every nail, every egg, every soldi for 40 years was finally letting go. And you can feel the reluctance in every word. The son's handwriting appears more frequently through 1570, then takes over completely in January 1571. Giovanni Battista's marginal notes continue for a while. Correct. I agree. Check this. But they grow sparser as the months pass. By summer, they stop entirely. The ledger becomes the son's book now, and you have to adjust to a new voice, a new way of seeing the vineyard. The son is competent, you can tell that much. He records the same information his father did, follows the same format, maintains the same precision. But he lacks something, some quality you can't quite name. The ledger has become a record again, not a presence. Giovanni Battista's death appears in the book indirectly, as these things often do. March 15th, 1571. My father passed away this morning. He had been ill since winter, and we knew it was coming, but still it is hard. I will continue the ledger as he would have wished. That's all. No eulogy, no outpouring of grief. Just the bare fact recorded in the son's careful hand. But you notice that the entry is smudged, just as his father's was when he recorded the death of his infant daughter all those years ago. Some things don't change. Some things can't be helped. The months after Giovanni Battista's death show the vineyard continuing its rhythm, as vineyards do. The pruning happened, the sheep came and went, the harvest was gathered and pressed. The son recorded it all, following the template his father had established, keeping the machinery of accounting running. But you notice small changes. He buys things his father never bought. A book from Florence, a new cloak for himself, a gift for his wife. He sells things his father never sold. A small plot of woodland, some old tools, a cow that had stopped giving milk. He is his own man, this son. with his own priorities, his own sense of what matters. The workers appear differently in the son's entries. He records their names, their wages, their tasks, but there's less sense of them as individuals. Tommaso Illinois Rosso is still there, older now, slower, but he's just a name on a page. La Pina appears occasionally, but without the small notes about her bread or her chickens. The son records the transactions, nothing more. You wonder if he knew these people the way his father did, if he grew up alongside them, if he felt the same mixture of dependence and affection. Probably not. He was of a different generation, a different world, and the ledger reflects that distance. The dispute with Matteo da Panzano reappears briefly in 1572, and you see that the son handles it differently than his father would have. Matteo has moved the boundary stone again. I went to see him, and we talked. He agreed to move it back, and I agreed to let him have a small strip of land that he wanted, in exchange for peace. The matter is settled. Giovanni Battista would have fought, would have hired lawyers and surveyors and fought to the last florin. His son compromised, gave away what his father had fought for, and bought peace at a price his father would never have paid. Was that wisdom or weakness? The ledger doesn't say. It just records the settlement and moves on. The estate itself changes under the son's management. He plants new vines, different varieties, things his father never tried. He sells some of the olive trees, saying they were old and unproductive. He builds a new shed, larger than the old one, with space for more barrels. He is modernizing, improving, doing what a new generation always does. The vineyard becomes more efficient, more productive, but somehow less itself. You miss the old ways, the familiar entries, the sense that this place had been run the same way for decades. But that's nostalgia talking, not history. The vineyard had to change, had to adapt, had to survive. The son was doing what his father would have wanted, even if his father wouldn't have done it that way. The ledger entries grow longer under the son's hand, more detailed in some ways, less in others. He records everything his father recorded, but he adds new categories: interest on loans, depreciation of equipment, calculations of profit margins that his father never bothered with. He is more businesslike, more modern, more aware of the vineyard as a financial asset rather than a way of life. The numbers tell a different story now, a story of optimization and efficiency and the bottom line. You learn things from these entries, things Giovanni Battista never thought to record. But you also lose things, the small human details that made the old ledger feel like a conversation. The handwriting itself tells you something about the son. It's consistent, careful, almost impersonal. He writes the same way whether he's recording a death or a purchase of nails. There are no asides, no complaints about the weather, no moments of unexpected emotion. The ledger has become what it always pretended to be, a dry record of income and expenses. The man behind it has disappeared into the numbers, leaving only the facts behind. You can't help feeling that something has been lost, something essential, something you can't quite name. Giovanni Battista's ghost haunts the margins of these later pages. Sometimes the son refers to him, as my father used to do. My father always said, this was my father's favorite vine. He is keeping his father's memory alive, in his way, by continuing the work his father began. But the work itself has changed, and the memory is filtered through the son's own experience. You wonder what Giovanni Battista would think if he could see his ledger now, filled with his son's neat handwriting, recording a world that is both the same and completely different. Would he be proud, or sad, or simply grateful that the book continued? You'll never know. The ledger doesn't say. As the 1570s progress, You notice that the son's entries become more confident, more settled. He has found his rhythm, his way of running the vineyard. The crisis of succession has passed, and the estate has survived the transition. The workers who remember Giovanni Battista are dying off or retiring, replaced by younger men who never knew the old owner. The vineyard becomes the son's vineyard, in fact as well as in law. And the ledger, once Giovanni Battista's voice, becomes the son's. It's the same book, the same pages, but the story has changed. You read on, because you want to know what happens next. But part of you misses the old voice, the old stories, the old man who wrote about wolves and hail and the taste of new wine. The final pages of the ledger approach, and you find yourself slowing down, reluctant to reach the end. The son's handwriting continues through the 1570s and into the 1580s, regular and reliable, recording the same cycles you've followed for 4 decades. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the entries begin to thin out. There are gaps now, weeks with nothing recorded, then months. The son is losing interest, or perhaps just getting busy with other things. The ledger that was once the center of a life is becoming an afterthought. The last complete year is 1581. You read through it carefully, savoring the familiar rhythm of the seasons one final time. January, pruning and mending. February, more pruning, the first signs of spring. March, the sheep arrive, the ground is prepared. April, anxious watching for frost and disease. May, the vines flower, a good sign. June, the grapes set, small and green. July, the long wait, the constant vigilance. August, heat, but not too much, the grapes swelling nicely. September, the harvest, baskets and baskets of fruit, the press working day and night. October, the tithe, the offerings, the first taste of new wine. November, the feast of San Martino, the workers gathering, the wine flowing. December, the accounts balanced, the year's totals recorded, the ledger closed for another 12 months. And then, nothing. The next page is dated January 1582, but there are no entries. Just the date, written in the son's hand, and then blank space. You turn the page, hoping for more, but it's the same. Blank pages, page after page, stretching to the end of the book. The ledger stops, not with a conclusion but with an absence. The story simply ends, mid-sentence, midlife, mid-harvest. You'll never know what happened in 1582, or 1583, or any of the years that followed. The son stopped writing, and the vineyard's voice fell silent. You sit with the closed ledger for a long moment, feeling the weight of it in your hands. 40 years of a man's life, reduced to this book. 40 years of weather and work, of births and deaths, of wine and oil and the endless struggle to make the numbers add up. Giovanni Battista wrote it all down, every nail, every egg, every soldi, because he believed that if you recorded everything, nothing would be lost. And in a way, he was right. You're here, 4 centuries later, reading his words, knowing his world. The ledger kept its promise. It held on to everything, and now it's given it all to you. But what did it hold? Not just numbers, you realize. Not just accounts. It held the shape of a life, the rhythm of days and seasons, the small dramas and quiet satisfactions that made up a human existence. It held Tommaso Illinois Rosso, working for 32 years and dying with a single sentence of acknowledgement. It held La Pina, washing and cooking and surviving widowhood with nothing but her own labor. It held the sheep, the ox, the vines themselves, all the living things that shared this hillside with the Orsini family. It held the hailstorms and the droughts, the good years and the bad, the constant uncertainty of a life lived close to the land. It held Giovanni Battista himself, the man behind the pen, the man who wrote about wolves and wept over his vines and fought his neighbor for 3 feet of earth. You think about the things the ledger doesn't say. The sound of the workers' voices in the vineyard, calling to each other across the rows. The smell of the wine press in autumn, sweet and sticky and overwhelming. The feel of the sun on your face in May, when the vines are flowering and everything seems possible. The taste of new wine at the feast of San Martino, sharp and young and full of the year just past. The ledger doesn't record these things, but they are there anyway, between the lines, in the spaces where the numbers stop and the world begins. Giovanni Battista didn't need to write them down. They were the context, the background, the air he breathed. He assumed they would always be there, that anyone reading his ledger would know them without being told. But you don't know them. You're 400 years away, in a different world, a different century. You've never smelled a wine press or tasted new wine or stood in a vineyard watching the grapes swell under the August sun. Giovanni Battista's world is as foreign to you as the moon. And yet here you are, reading his ledger, feeling his presence, understanding something fundamental about what it meant to be alive in the 16th century. The numbers did that. The dry, meticulous, obsessive numbers built a bridge across the centuries and let you walk into someone else's life. You close the book gently, careful not to damage the fragile spine. The librarian will come soon to take it back to the vault, where it will sleep in the darkness until another reader requests it. But for now, it's yours, this window into a vanished world. You sit with it a moment longer, letting the silence settle around you. The afternoon light has shifted, grown longer and more golden. The reading room is quiet. The other scholars bent over their own documents, their own windows into the past. You're all doing the same thing, really. Trying to hear the voices of the dead. Trying to understand lives that ended long before you were born. Giovanni Battista would understand. You think. He spent his life recording, preserving, holding on to things that would otherwise be forgotten. He would be pleased that someone, 400 years later, is still reading his words, still counting his nails and his eggs and his soldi, still walking his vineyard in the imagination, still tasting his wine, still hearing the voices of his workers across the rows. The ledger did its job. It kept the record. And now, in this quiet room in Florence, you've received it. You stand, stretch, hand the book back to the librarian. She smiles, nods, disappears into the stacks. The ledger is gone, returned to its shelf, its long sleep. But it's not really gone. It's in you now. The story of a man and his vineyard, the shape of a life reduced to numbers and then expanded again into meaning. You'll carry it with you, this story, this voice from the past. And maybe someday, you'll tell it to someone else. That's how it works, after all. That's how the dead keep speaking. One person reads, remembers, passes it on. The chain continues, link by link, across the centuries. Now, as the light fades and the reading room grows quiet, you gather your things and prepare to leave. The day is ending. The story is told. Outside, the streets of Florence are filling with evening, with the sounds of life continuing, with all the things Giovanni Battista never recorded and never needed to. You step out into that life, carrying his ledger in your memory, his voice in your ears. The numbers fade, the details blur, but the feeling remains. The feeling of having known someone, across 400 years, across the impossible distance of time. The feeling that the dead are not really gone. Not as long as someone remembers. Not as long as the ledger survives. And so you close the book on Illinois Poggio, on Giovanni Battista and his workers and his vines. The story ends where it began, in the quiet of an archive, with a book returning to its shelf. But the echoes linger, the voices carry. The numbers continue to add up in ways no accountant could predict. You step out into the Florentine evening, the city humming around you. And for a moment you think you can smell it. The wine press in autumn, the hay in summer, the wood smoke of a November feast. It's just your imagination, of course. Just the ledger, working its magic one last time. The night settles over Florence, over the hills where the vineyard once stood, over the archive where the ledger sleeps. Giovanni Battista's world is gone, replaced by highways and smartphones and all the things he couldn't imagine. But some things remain. The shape of a hillside, the taste of a grape, the satisfaction of a day's work done well, and the quiet voice of a man who wrote it all down, who believed that if you recorded everything, nothing would be lost. He was right. Nothing was lost. It's all here, in this story, in this moment, in the space between you and the page. Now, dim the lights a little more, let your breathing slow, and carry Giovanni Battista with you into sleep. He'd like that, probably. After 40 years of keeping watch over his vineyard, he'd appreciate someone keeping watch over his memory. The ledger is closed, the story is told, and the night is waiting. Sweet dreams.